In this nugget, we'll take a look at Configuration Manager. This is an overview where we're going to look at the various features of Configuration Manager. This won't be exhaustive, but it's very important to know what it's capable of doing. We'll look at the hierarchy of Configuration Manager and the sites that are part of that hierarchy. Let's go ahead and get started. You know, I remember when I was in the 4th grade, I was standing on some risers during a Christmas concert, and I was, singing my heart out here. And out in the audience, I could see the beaming faces of these proud parents, all trying to look as if we sounded good. And about the middle of the concert, the choir director motioned for me to come down and to play this xylophone that was down in front. You've probably seen those before. That has little wooden planks on it. You're supposed to hit it with a mallet, right? Problem was, I've never touched the xylophone before. And nor have I touched one since, for which everyone's grateful. But she kept motioning for me to do that. It got to be kind of awkward. I didn't know why she wanted me to go down there to play it. So finally, I decided to go down there and stand in front of it, held the mallet in my hand, and I could hear the music starting in the background and the kids singing behind me. So I started smashing this thing and playing with all my heart. And the parents, fortunately, they were polite enough to keep smiles on their faces. I think actually they were laughing at me. But anyway, it was a very awkward moment because I had no earthly idea what to do with this xylophone other than to just smash it. Fortunately also, there's no camcorders back in that day. I'm from the caveman era. Probably on some cave drawing somewhere, you'll see a drawing a lot like this, depicting that very awkward situation. Well, that's kind of how we feel sometimes when we actually work with Configuration Manager, because there's so many features, and I've got kind of a short list here, but there's so many features. The UI is so complex, and there's so many different things you can do. In fact, here it is right here, that you could probably spend half a day just going through here and right-clicking on things and choosing options and going through items here and looking at properties of things. There's so many buttons, levers, and switches to pull here that it's really, really involved to try to get to know what all of it does. That's part of why we're here, right? So first thing we want to do is to establish what some of the features are that are available in Configuration Manager and why we want to use it. And I'll give you the main reason why we want to use it, and that's because everybody wants to go home by 5 o'clock, right? I'm not talking about the users, and the IT staff is still there at 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night. I'm talking about you. Yeah, you and I. We want to be done by 5 o'clock, right? 8 to 5 or something like that. Maybe an hour for lunch. We actually want to be able to take a legitimate lunch break for once and go to Chili's for lunch along with everybody else instead of having a peanut butter and jelly sandwich next to our workstation. So we want to do that, right? That's what Configuration Manager gets you. Some other people have said any good IT administrator should only work 40 hours a week. Why is that? Because you've got other things that are doing your work for you. You have PowerShell scripts, which is a little bit outside of our scope here right now. But you have PowerShell scripts. You have other kinds of automation going on. You have System Center Configuration Manager, which we generally just call Configuration Manager for our purposes, or Config Manager. And what this is going to do is it's going to do so much of this automatically for you that you really kind of become a hands-off administrator. You're just kind of there to look at reports every now and then, make sure everything went okay, and maybe troubleshoot it periodically if certain clients aren't reporting to the Config Manager server. But one of the basic ideas, for example, that this could do would be OS deployment. Now, if you go back with me to my old days of operating system installation, we used to have to install something like Windows for Workgroups using, I don't remember how many floppy disks it was, but it was a whole host, maybe a dozen or so floppy disks. Then we got promoted to using CDs and then DVDs. And then somewhere along the way, we also had other more automated methods for installation. Well, a lot of that is now deployed or implemented in the operating system deployment here, WIM files and those sorts of source files and so forth. Also, we could take a look here at using these features, things such as hardware and software inventory. Maybe you have a piece of software out there that was very expensive to license. And one day at the water fountain, you hear some of the users saying, hey, we've got this software, we never even use it. So you think, hey, wait a minute, we never even use it. That costs thousands of dollars a year to license. So you can inventory that software. You can actually see, through things such as software metering as well, who's actually using it or how much they're using it. It might turn out that you've got a very expensive product that nobody uses or cares about. You can get rid of it then. Save some money. There's also application and content management. What we want to do here is to make our applications kind of centrally available through distribution points, for example, and then if somebody needs that piece of software, we can either forcibly deploy it to them, or we even have a method where the users themselves can go and find if the software is available, and if it is, and we've given them permission to install it, then they can install it themselves. We have operating system and software updates. This is really born in WSUS, or Windows Software Update Services. That's supposed to be a U there. WSUS is what we usually call that. And that's kind of the foundation that we'll use here in Config Manager. Then the other thing we'll have here is client health and endpoint protection. Can I just touch on that briefly here? It's a very involved topic, and it's similar in some functions to network access protection. By the way, just a quick side note for you. Looks like Microsoft is going to do away with network access protection, which is part of the reason why I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time on it, but we will take a look at what we need to for it. There's also remote connectivity, or remote connections. You can configure, for example, how users remote connect. You can configure VPN connections for the users. Instead of having to go to each individual machine and create the connection for them. You can also configure how remote desktop works, or whether it's going to work for the users. And you can make the remote connections yourself. So if there's a desktop that needs some troubleshooting help, some help desk help or something like that, you can reach out and make a remote desktop connection to those remote machines. Now this is kind of a short list of the things that you can do, but these are some of the main players, I think, that will help to save you a lot of time once you start to implement Config Manager. Now, although it's kind of tempting to start just installing stuff and get Configuration Manager going, that's not really going to be ideal, because we need to first of all understand what we need to install. There's several different ways to install Configuration Manager, primarily revolving around the site hierarchy, and that's what we're going to look at here, the Configuration Manager hierarchy. This is very often going to be determined by the kind of WAN links that you have. You might be well connected everywhere. You might have fiber all over the place and everything, and sometimes in fiber organizations, your fiber connections on the WAN link are faster than the LAN links in each site. So that might not be an issue for you in some respects. However, there could be organizational requirements that you have, so that different departments have their own cost center, their own IT departments. Each individual IT department doesn't necessarily work with or is subject to another IT department. So if they're all independent that way, then again, you might need different sites for those locations. So it's going to often to be determined by organizational requirements, by WAN connections. For example, if you have a small branch office with slow slow connectivity, not just internet connectivity, but slow WAN link connectivity, then you probably wouldn't want to install a primary down there. We'll discuss the differences between all of those coming up. This is also going to follow along existing Active Directory sites as well, but again, not always. They can be used kind of as guidelines, if you will. Now, there are three types of sites that we really need to address. The first one here would be a Central Administration Site, or a CAS, as we often call that. And we'll explain what that is, but basically it's going to be kind of the root of the whole infrastructure, and everything else is going to branch off down beneath a central administration site. However, many organizations can work with a primary site and then maybe some secondaries. The primary site is capable of handling an amazing number of clients. In fact, can handle 100,000 clients. Okay, so that's quite a few there, and normally you don't have 100,000 clients in a single site anyway. So it's very, very capable, and if we just install that, and that's all we install, we would call that normally a standalone primary site. But you may also have secondary sites for those small branch offices where you have slow WAN links, and that's going to help to control the bandwidth management there when you use a secondary site. And in these sites, the primary site, for example, most of what you do with Configuration Manager can be contained in that site. The software files, which will be stored on what we call a distribution point, can be there. You can put the whole thing on one server if you want to, SQL and Configuration Manager, and the file shares for your distribution points. All that stuff can be put on one, but generally speaking, we might split that up into multiple servers. Also, the secondary site, again, it's not going to be quite as full-featured as a primary site, but we'll discuss the differences there as well coming up. All sites do require a database. Generally speaking, Microsoft's recommendation is that you dedicate the SQL Server to only Configuration Manager. But if you're very well versed with SQL and you know what kind of loads it can handle and you're pretty familiar with what your servers are capable of, you might want to split that up and put other purposes for those SQL databases there as well. But generally, we try to dedicate them. Now, here's something that's new with Service Pack 1 and R2 of Configuration Manager 2012. You can now change the hierarchy. It used to be that if you were to install, let's just say, a standalone primary site And then it turns out, oops, you know what? We really need multiple primary sites. Well, you're stuck because you have only one primary site. If you want multiple primary sites and not a standalone primary site, you'd have to use a central administration site and then branch off primaries underneath it. Well, if you started with only a standalone primary, you're stuck. And in order to go to multiple primaries and a CAS, you'd have to rip the whole thing out and start over again. Now, with Configuration Manager 2012 and R2, you are now capable of changing that hierarchy after the fact, which is a very welcome change to Configuration Manager. So when we take a look at the pieces of the hierarchy, the Central Administration Site, or CAS, is what you can normally have in larger organizations or global organizations. The CAS becomes the root of primary and secondary sites. A general rule of thumb here would be that you don't use a CAS unless you need multiple Configuration Manager sites. If you only need a single Configuration Manager site, you might as well just have a standalone primary. But if you need multiples, then you need to start with the CAS, and then you branch your primaries off of that. So here's my CAS, for example. Maybe this is my hub office in a global organization or something. And then, I've got cities here, separate cities here with primaries. So I got a primary here, I got a primary here, and then maybe this primary here has a couple of secondaries with slow WAN links. A secondary here, with slow WAN links, and then it's going to limit the times and bandwidth, potentially, if I want to do it that way, of the traffic that goes from the secondary up to the primary. We'll talk more about secondaries and primaries coming up. Now, my clients are not assigned and don't process client data from the CAS. In other words, my users, my laptops, my various devices, all of those things never communicate directly with the CAS. The primaries and the secondaries will force up their data. They'll flow up the data ultimately to the CAS. And since there's SQL databases in each one of these sites, they will also all synchronize with one another. So all that data should eventually reach convergence there, and they should have awareness of what's going on here. Secondaries actually receive a subset of some of the data, however. Okay, so mostly you're going to use the CAS, though, again, kind of as the hanger to branch all the rest of this off of. But it's going to be used mostly for reporting and centralization of the metadata. The roles there are going to be for asset intelligence, synchronization, and this is going to be where it just kind of puts everything together in something that makes sense. We'll take a look at more about that as we move along and actually work with Configuration Manager. Then there's also reporting services. Obviously, you're going to be pulling data from all of these other sites. Then the central administration site will be able to perform good reporting there. Software update can be part of the roles that it has up there if you want to. A system health validator, that's part of your NAP or network access protection role. And then endpoint protection roles as well. Now these two asterisk items that we see right here, that's just to point out, I didn't want to forget to mention this, that these two items, asset intelligence synchronization and endpoint protection roles, can only be installed on a CAS server. You don't install those on primaries or secondaries. Now the rest of this is actually pretty simple. What we're going to be working with in our demonstrations and throughout the rest of this series will be just a single standalone primary site. And that's the simplest way to get your feet wet with Configuration Manager and to work with it. Plus, anything you can do really in a standalone primary, you can do in secondaries and if you're using a CAS and all the rest of that. It's just that all of the pieces, so to speak, are going to be centrally located on a single system for demonstration purposes. But what we want to do with the primary site, though, is if we have a certain number of client systems. So, in other words, if you have 100,000 clients or less, you could work with a primary site. You still have to consider growth and possible mergers and things like that, of course. Or if you co-locate your standalone primary and SQL on the same server, then you're limited to 50,000. But still, that's quite a few, actually, isn't it? Also, all your clients are going to be assigned to primaries. They're not even assigned to secondaries. They're really assigned to primaries, and that's where the client will communicate as the management point. The primary site here could be your management point, and that's where it's going to give instructions to all of the clients that you have. Now, the primary site can be a child to a central administration site, or a primary site could be a standalone primary. Okay. In this earlier infrastructure I showed you over here, These were where they're childs. Okay, these two primaries are childs of the CAS. Here, and in the demonstrations we're working with, it's going to be a standalone primary site. And there's also the secondary site. What's this about? Secondary sites are childs to primaries. Secondary sites are not childs to CAS. They don't deliver data up to the CAS directly. They deliver data up instead to the primary, and then the primary delivers it up to the CAS. Okay, so that's what a secondary will be. It's a child only to a primary. Why would we even want to use a secondary? Seems like a primary could do everything I want, right? Well, normally it can, but primarily you're going to be using this if you have WAN problems or slow WAN links or oversaturated WAN links, and you want to control the client data transmission up the hierarchy. That's what you're going to be using a secondary. And for secondaries, you can use SQL Express. Remember I said earlier that every site, whether it's a CAS, primary, or secondary, they all use SQL. But on a secondary site, it can use SQL Express, which is free, and it's installable by default when you specify that you want to install a secondary site. So it's available if you want to use it there, and much simpler to install than an actual SQL server. All right, I better wrap this up. I have a xylophone lesson coming up this evening. Okay, no, I don't. Let's take a look at what we did here. We looked at Configuration Manager. This was an overview where we looked at the various features of Configuration Manager and see some of the powerful capabilities that it has. We looked at the hierarchy of Configuration Manager and the sites that are part of that hierarchy. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.